I want to do a special welcome to Ambassador Jeffrey, twice my boss, and I am living to tell about it. He was truly is a national treasure, really a national treasure, whose experience as a practitioner, as a strategic thinker, as a strategic leader in our government has very few rivals. So we're very honored to have him today. His work with our partners and allies on issues of top national security is similarly unparalleled. I'm sorry that we can't do this event in person, but the advantage of doing it virtually is that we can have both of our campuses involved, and it allows us to have welcoming comments from Major General Patrick Roberson, here with me, the Commanding General of the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School, with whom CISA and JSOMA enjoy a truly special relationship, particularly in pressing the importance of education and irregular warfare. Major General Roberson is also a visionary leader and thinker, and I want to thank him for his support too and partnership with the JSOMA faculty and students. Thank you.
Okay, so we should now have Mr. Chris Dilworth, our Department of State student, offering an introduction. Chris.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, everyone.
It's a double pleasure to talk to you today because first, I am thrilled to be able to say a big CISA welcome to our new Chancellor, Ambassador Greta Holtz. Welcome, Ambassador. Second, it is my great honor to be asked to introduce our guest speaker today, Ambassador Jim Jeffrey. There is no one better to talk to us at CISA than Ambassador Jeffrey, who has spent his entire career working on the issues of irregular warfare as a soldier and a diplomat working in Republican and Democratic administrations alike. Although you could never tell from his accent, Ambassador Jeffrey hails from Massachusetts and holds a BA from Northeastern University and an MA from Boston University. He served as a U.S. Army infantry officer from 1969 to 1976 in Vietnam and Germany, and then joined the Foreign Service in 1977, serving primarily in Europe and the Middle East. In Washington, Ambassador Jeffrey had multiple senior positions, including the Deputy Coordinator for Bosnia Implementation and Deputy National Security Advisor in the second Bush administration. Ambassador Jeffrey has served as ambassador to Iraq, Turkey, and Albania. Most recently, he came out of retirement in 2018 to serve as Special Representative for Syria Engagement and Special Presidential Envoy to the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS. Ambassador Jeffrey is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award, the Secretary of Defense's Medal for Distinguished Civilian Service, the Director of Central Intelligence's Medal, and the Bronze Star. Ambassador Jeffrey has thought long and hard about the problems of irregular warfare, first in the Cold War and now in the era of strategic competition. You may have seen the piece he just published with the Wilson Center, warning of Moscow's potential implementation of Syria rules in Ukraine. I am also very pleased to have Ambassador Jeffrey with us today because he is perhaps the most candid diplomat I know. He is not afraid to say inconvenient truths, say them plainly, and say them loudly. My first encounter with Ambassador Jeffrey was as a back row attendee at a meeting in the White House Situation Room, while he was beaming in from Baghdad, where he was serving as ambassador. He bluntly told the assembled high-level interagency officials why the policy proposal under discussion was moving too slowly and wouldn't get the job done. I look forward to such candor this morning. Ambassador Jeffrey, on behalf of CISA, welcome and thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Chris, thank you very much. First of all, Greta, I really appreciate your introductory comments. General Robeson, it's good to see you again. As I said a bit earlier, I may be your oldest living graduate of your program, and that was one of the high points of my very short military career. Once again, it is an honor for me to be here speaking to you at NDU and in CISA on a subject that I've followed for many years and believe is extremely important in the current situation. That is strategic competition, which has reared its ugly head just recently for us, although our competitors have been planning for this for years in Russia and in China, and our regional competitors, North Korea and Iran, for many decades. Irregular warfare, in my view, is almost certainly going to be a common, if not the predominant, element of strategic competition based upon history and the situation we have today. But in this new world, because strategic competition is new in some respects to the national security apparatus here in the United States and frankly among many of our partners and allies, irregular warfare is not. But the way the two will come together requires a look at how everything works with diplomacy. The reason is that you're dealing with two levels of political involvement. You all know irregular warfare is highly political. It's focused on by, with, and through, and the center of gravity is the civilian population, the local government, their capabilities, loyalties, and the relationship we have with them. That won't change. But strategic competition, as I'll discuss briefly in a bit, is also highly political. The strategies we use, the way we do our work is very much focused on the diplomatic as much as the military, and that is not going to change as we move forward. But this presents a predicament for people in the field. Those of you, civilian and military, American, or our international fellows who've been involved in irregular warfare, and that is many of you, most of what you're going to be doing in the future will not be very different than what you've been doing in the past 20 or 30 years. We're going to need your skills, so be ready. But nonetheless, it's really important to know what will be different and how that will impact you and how we're all going to work on that. Let me review briefly some basic points of foreign policy and diplomacy, as that's one of the three points of what we're doing today, along with irregular warfare, which is your job here at CISA to work out the details of. I'm not an expert in that per se, and strategic competition, which I do have some comments on. These principles, which are just thrown up, you've all seen them before, but there's a difference between knowing something and actually making that part of your subconscious major muscle movement frame of reference for everything you're doing. And this has been of late a problem, not here at NDU. It's a problem for the entire foreign policy apparatus in the United States and among our partners and allies. Core goals, those are obvious from foreign policy theory. Point about what we have been doing since World War II. A global order organized around many things, but most importantly, security, and security to be obtained through containment of challenges to that order, deterrence of major war. The first point about this, because it's relevant to where we're going forward, is that this was not simply what the United States did. We played a leading role, but we could have not done this without the support of the many countries, and the international fellows are representing many of them today, that stood by us over the years and in some cases took leading roles. That won't change either. This is a collective endeavor in the past and in the future. Secondly, despite many ups and downs from the Bay of Pigs to Vietnam to Afghanistan, this has been a tremendously successful system, not only in increasing the prosperity and the freedom of people all around the world, but most importantly, in avoiding a return to the horrors of 1914, 1945. It's going to be the way we will deal with strategic competition going forward. We can see this already with this administration, NATO, and other international actors' response to both Taiwan and Ukraine. We see it in the many references to the containment approach, the alliance approach in the interim national security strategy guidance, and we see it in the support of the American people for this engagement. According to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, it's some 85% of our population supports to one or another degree our military, strong military presence, our leadership in the role, and our advancement of international values around the world. So as we go forward, we're going to go forward together. and we're going to go forward with this kind of global strategy. The other thing is there's a lot of pessimism right now. Some of it's being generated by the very, very dire situation with Ukraine, but some of it from the way that we were caught by surprise to some degree, all of us, by the rise of these major challenges to the international order. We may have a rocky period ahead, but I'm confident that we're going to do well. We have taken together the United States, all of our partners and allies, far more strength, economic, military, scientific, energy, values, than those who are competing against us. There's no reason if we work together and follow smart policies, we can do very well as we did for the now some 80 years since 1940. A bit on diplomacy. It gets confused with foreign policy all of the time, including by Henry Kissinger in his book on foreign policy, which he unfortunately titled Diplomacy, but nonetheless, it's one level below foreign policy. It's operational, it's the plans and the execution of operations to advance policy. There's three core elements: the specific policy, that's like the military with the mission statement at the very center of all planning and operations. The characteristic activity of the diplomatic environment, that is communication and negotiation with foreign actors. The analogy is law, where you have mainly the advancing of your activity through communications with various partners and opponents. And finally, you have means. Now, the means range from what the military calls TTPs, your basic SOPs on how you do any specific formal activity, all the way through the various tools. Some of them are in the foreign policy environment, that is foreign assistance, it's information operations. Many of them we draw on other parts of the US government or of our partner governments, and we have also the military. These means usually in dealing with foreign actors fall into two categories: carrots and sticks, and it's this manipulation of them that makes up the art of the diplomatic actor. One thing that we hear a lot these days, but is absolutely wrong, is the idea that military force and diplomacy are two separate ways of dealing with the outside world. They're not, they are linked. You cannot have a military operation or a potential military operation without embracing some kind of diplomatic strategy to get your overall policy mission accomplished, which is the whole purpose of military force. By the same token, diplomacy, trying to work with foreign partners, apart from things like trade agreements with the Europeans or global warming discussions around the world, diplomacy, if it involves security, is going to involve at one level, implicitly or explicitly, military force or the use potentially of military force. Our enemies and foes know this. We need to focus more on it. On strategic competition, my assumption is, based upon where the US government is, where NATO is, where our various partners in East Asia and elsewhere are, that we will continue the containment model. At heart, containment over the many years that we did this from 1947, 48 through 1989, 1990, is a political approach to dealing with challenges to the global order. It has significant military, particularly defensive military components, but it is all integrated into an overall political approach to force challenges to that order, to weigh every day the pros and cons of whether that challenger wants to roll the dice on a major challenge, particularly a military challenge to the system. The goal of containment is to make that challenger decide, I'm going to sit on my hands for another day and see what tomorrow will bring, rather than push the button for something really dramatic. That's how it worked throughout the 40 years of the Cold War. This requires, it certainly did for the United States and most of our allies during the Cold War, the absorption of most of our forces, but because the challengers almost always do not push that button, traditional warfare never really occurred, with a minor exception. Well, it wasn't minor for the people involved, but right at the beginning, the Korean War, where we fought not the Soviet Union, but two Soviet allies, North Korea and China. But we did that because not of our containment policy, but a violation of it. We put South Korea outside of our perimeter, containment perimeter for East Asia explicitly. The North Koreans took that as an invite, in they went. We changed our mind, and then we decided to roll back the North Koreans by advancing beyond our own borders, which is one of the violations of containment theory, because it makes the other side react very actively, which is exactly what the Chinese did. But beyond that, we never saw a conventional war with the Soviets. But what we did see was efforts by the communist world to challenge us on the perimeter. In the first few years of the Cold War, from 1946 to roughly 1952, there were some 10 or 11 challenges from Berlin, moving counterclockwise all the way down through Greece, Iran, Tibet, Malaya, Philippines, all the way up to Korea. Only one of them, Soviet pressure on Turkey for the Dardanelles, was a state-state conflict. Didn't get to fighting, but it was quite dramatic for a while. All of the others, Berlin, Greece I mentioned, Iran, the Philippines, Indochina, and on, were irregular warfare scenarios of one another sort. They involved divided countries, breakaway provinces or states, insurgencies, civil wars. And that pattern continued for the entire 40 years of the Cold War. The idea being that the competitor, the challenger, does not want to risk it all on a major conflict, but wants to wear down the other side. In the end, we weren't worn down, but the Cold War saw many hot conflicts, and the United States was involved in many of them, as were, again, many of our partners. So my assumption is that we will see the same pattern. In fact, we're already seeing it. Things like pressure on Taiwan, many aspects of the Ukraine crisis, some aspects of the South China Sea. We're already seeing irregular warfare type environments and scenarios in the competition with China and Russia. In a way, again, that's good, because we all have experience in irregular warfare. We know what it's like, and much of what we will see will resemble the last 30 years, beginning with the center of gravity, as I said, with the population and local governments, and our preferred way of going about this, which is by, with, and through. But the differences are decisive, and let me touch on them a bit. First, there's more at stake. And that gets to what we call in the Vietnam era the domino theory. That is, someone challenging the system on the edges wants to weaken the basic fundament of containment, which is the US and a group of countries serve as a 911 whenever there is a challenge, regardless of how important or small the country that is being threatened is. If you do not respond to these challenges, then the whole logic of containment starts unraveling. What this means is that our challengers pick or find available vulnerable countries, vulnerable societies, vulnerable populations, where there are deep instabilities, where there are weak governments, where there are populations that are divided ideologically or ethnically or religiously. And they will seize upon that to try to push their perimeter forward. The temptation often is not to respond if the country isn't particularly important. But again, that drags up the very big problem of the domino theory, which is that if we won't protect a small country, what makes people think we'll protect a somewhat bigger country? We went through this in the 1930s, and the conclusion is we pretty much have to defend the entire perimeter. That is a vulnerability. It's our Achilles heel, because the other side will exploit that. So again, there's more at stake in these conflicts. We can't just walk away. You saw with Afghanistan, which really had nothing to do with strategic competition, the shock through the international system when the US and NATO decided it would no longer contest the security and political situation in that country. Whatever the reasons, good or bad, for doing that after 20 years, it made a huge negative impression on the entire international community. That is how central this idea of containment and response to challenges is, and the importance of credibility. So again, we have much at stake. On the other side, on the more positive side, there are other ways to approach dealing with the population and by, with, and through than what we've experienced over the last 25 years. I don't want to revisit those last 25 years. Many of us lived through them in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places. But to draw a reference from a RAND study that was published in 2008 or 2009, The Beginner's Guide to Nation Building, there's two ways to approach the local population, the local government: deconstruction and co-option. We were on deconstruction with steroids during the first decade of this century in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and to some degree in some of the other operations we did beginning in the late Clinton administration and in the early Obama administration. Regime change, rebuilding countries, what one critic of the whole thing, Michael Mandelbaum, called trying to make everybody look like Denmark. This is a very tough mission. It's a tough mission for the military. It's a tough mission for the civilian component that is out there working with the military and working with local populations, working with governments. It's very, very hard because the operation is to transform, take your pick, a government, a state, a population. And the supporting line of effort is fending off those people who are trying through force to block or slow down the project. Through the Cold War, we used another alternative, which again, the RAND report called co-option. That is, you basically deal with the government and the population that you have before you. You're not trying to transform them. That's not the primary goal. You're trying to protect them from some challenge. The primary line of effort is to block, deter, contain, push back that challenge, not to change the entire makeup of the population. That is somewhat easy. As a RAND study, and this was a study that very much supported the very ambitious goals of the Bush administration at the time in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, but nonetheless, it admitted that trying to do deconstruction is going to be a much longer project. It's going to be much more difficult. It's going to cost a lot more, and the resistance to it will be much greater. And we've just lived 20 years of seeing how true that is. Thus, my prediction is, just like in the Cold War, from Greece in 1947 to El Salvador in 1987, we are going to use the co-option model. This puts us on the defensive. To quote Clausewitz, the defensive, while it has negative results in his mind, is the stronger of the two. It's easier to defend your perimeter than it is to try to advance your values or your interests in places where they may not be totally welcome. So in a way, we will have an advantage, and we did have advantages in doing this in many places. Most of them turned out in our favor. We also have the option of not going for total victories. During the early years of this century, it was President Bush's phrase, I don't do base runs, I do home runs. And that reflected not just his view, it reflected, frankly, the view of our leadership from the middle of the 1990s on forward, again, probably into the first term of the Obama administration. In the Cold War, you're not going to get home runs. You're going to settle for compromise solutions. Indochina, peace in Geneva in 1954. Both sides just put down their arms temporarily to go fight again. The ceasefire in Korea. the Vietnam Agreement in 1973, the Paris Accords. Again and again, the Berlin Wall Agreement. We let them keep their wall, but we stayed on our side. Again and again, there are partial or compromise victories, and they serve to preserve the system overall. So in a way, we have an easier mission at the political level. Lastly, we will have domestic support. The American people, while they turned their backs on Johnson over Vietnam and Harry Truman over Korea, and neither ran again in 52 and 68, never really abandoned the effort. We still have troops in Korea, and 4 years after Tet, Richard Nixon, 72, won a presidential election that was only on one issue, Vietnam, with 49 out of 50 states. So the American people are willing to continue and make sacrifices. We've just seen another Chicago Council poll that a plurality of Americans, 43%, think we should use military force to defend Taiwan, and over 50% think that we should have an alliance with that island. So despite all the turbulence with the American public over our foreign policy in the last 20 plus years, they're willing to bear this burden. The final difference with irregular warfare, or warfare generally, when we didn't have strategic competition, is even more attention to what people learn in military colleges and places like NDU, which is to focus on clear missions and the resources to carry out those missions. That's important in any context, but there's a couple of special things about irregular warfare in the strategic competition environment that I urge folks to pay very close attention to. And it flows from the fact that you've got two levels of political involvement in what otherwise would be military decisions. First of all, look at the mission. Is it really strategic competition or related to it? Time and time again during the Cold War, twice in Lebanon, in the Dominican Republic, Grenada, Panama, the Congo, and a few other places, because containment was the shiny new object at the time, people embraced that to try to get us to engage in various conflicts that really didn't involve competing with the Soviet Union and Communist China. And we'll see this again today. Again, strategic competition is the shiny new object, and there are many people in Washington and in capitals in Europe and elsewhere who will try to label any conflict, any problem, any international issue as something involving strategic competition and try to drag us in. We don't have the troops, we don't have the diplomatic bandwidth to get involved in these things. Next, is it a containment mission or a rollback mission? Again, the sense, and it's been common in the United States ever since World War II, not just in the last 20 years, to have these home runs, pushes us to want to see clear-cut real victories. In the United States military in the 1960s, when I joined, the Korean War was seen as shameful. We didn't have a clear victory after 4 conflicts beginning in the Civil War, where the other side basically surrendered. And it was hard for even my Army comrades to understand that in many respects, Korea was a success. We held the line. We proved the point that we would fight even for relatively distant places. But in looking at how the world has evolved, and the desire not simply to hold the line, but to advance our values and frankly our alliance systems, we've again and again turned to trying to roll back the other side. The Cuban Missile Crisis flowed from the actions that we did initially with the Bay of Pigs in 1961. Castro probably wouldn't have invited in those Soviet nuclear weapons, if he didn't fear that we were going to try again to overthrow him. So that didn't work out well. The Bay of Pigs was a failure. Our efforts to try to get new governments over many years in Nicaragua and today in Venezuela are not successful either. Rollback is a very dangerous and also very expensive in terms of troops, in terms of diplomatic bandwidth. It's something that we should avoid. In the case of troops to task, the problem is that because of the political nature of these conflicts, again, Washington or NATO or whatever coalition we're involved in is likely to want to have a very clear-cut and broad success, a broad victory, but is not willing to give the resources to achieve that. So the delta is filled by, frankly, some kind of political deus ex machina, or as I call it, a tooth fairy that will simply say, because we're good, something nice will happen. In 1975, our ambassador in Vietnam, Graham Martin, thought that the North Vietnamese would not seize Hanoi. The US military would not have to either defend it or organize a huge retrograde operation, because he was assured by the Polish ambassador it wouldn't happen. And he was believed for a while. In Iraq, we saw this several times. We saw this with the claims that the population would embrace us. We saw this with the idea that Saddam was ready to leave, or that CIA contacts with various generals indicated that with a little bit more American military pressure, there would be a coup and our problems would be solved. Sometimes this happens. We succeeded in the Greek Civil War as easily as we eventually did because President Tito of Yugoslavia broke with Stalin and with the communist world and stopped the support to the insurgents in the Greek Civil War. So sometimes it does play out to our advantage. It usually doesn't. It should not be counted upon. If the military is given a military mission to have some effect, from deterrence to destruction of some enemy force in an irregular warfare scenario, it needs to have the military wherewithal to do that, to do the troops to task. To rely on some kind of political manna from heaven is not going to work. It hasn't worked repeatedly. Given the situation that we're facing with the two levels of politics intruding, that inherent to irregular warfare and that inherent to strategic competition, it's critically important to have very close relations between the civilian component of any alliance, the United States, NATO, and such, and the military forces. Now that's doctrine. It's in 3-24. But how to do that has been, in many ways, quite complicated over the past 25 years. It starts with the fact that the State Department, which tends to be, or not tends to be, it is almost always the main civilian component element overseas because of the authorities that the ambassador on the scene from the president and the State Department by its authorities under the Constitution and US law have in leading the civilian element. That has been a troubled relationship in our irregular warfare scenarios over the past 20 years. If you look at Iraq, we had 6 general ambassador combinations from 2003 to 2012. From my experience, 3 of them were very good, 2 of them were various degrees of bad, and 1 of them we still can't quite figure out how it really worked out. We have to do better than that. That requires understanding what the state civilian component can and can do and how it works. First of all, the civilian component cannot run countries. It's not a colonial service. And frankly, colonial services didn't do well in the 20th century in any case. As 3-24 says, a system must deal with its root causes itself. The civilian component can help, as does certain elements of the military in some scenarios, but there's no secret formula to succeed rapidly. If that's the exit strategy, there is no exit strategy. These countries will evolve on a time scale that is inherent to them, not to us. Now, one problem that we have, and as I said, it's not the fault of the military. The military consumes gallons of ink trying to explain to itself and to the rest of the US government how it thinks the civilian component works or should work. And the reason for that is that the State Department is not good at explaining what it really does and how it does it. There's cultural reasons for that I won't get into, but I've been with the State Department for the better part of 40 plus years, and this has been my experience and that of many others. Part of the problem can be summarized by a wonderful statement that in some contexts we were really delighted to hear from my longtime colleague, Secretary retired Jim Mattis, which is essentially, if state is not funded, I need more ammo. Now, we always want more money in the State Department. I spent much of my career trying to get more USAID programs out the door, put political offices on the street, stand up PRTs or consulates in turbulent areas. But in another sense, that somewhat misconstrues what we're all about. I would put it another way. Give us smart foreign policy with decisive diplomatic execution, or give the military more ammunition. A classic example of this is US and Allied policy after World War I with Weimar Germany and the Bolsheviks. It was very bad, and the whole world needed a hell of a lot of ammunition 20 years later. After World War II, we pursued a different kind of foreign policy, both to Germany and to the success of the Bolsheviks, the Soviet Union. Germany became a friend and partner. The Soviet Union certainly didn't become, at that time, a friend and partner, but we didn't have to go to a major war with it. That's the kind of thing at the highest level that the State Department and the foreign policy apparatus can do. It can set the entire framework within which our country, other countries, the global community, and our military forces operate or don't operate. Now, focusing on the relationship between the commander in the field and, in most cases, the ambassador, but it can be a special envoy, it can be a State Department assistant secretary, it can be somebody from the White House. There are several things that are very important. First of all, while there are institutional arrangements to promote coordination and exchanges, there are attachés and other military offices at every embassy. There are in Washington and abroad and in allied countries, all kinds of civilian military task forces. The State Department has over 100 political advisors with military commands. Other countries do similar things. But nonetheless, it all comes down to not institutions, but a personal relationship between a commander and his or her civilian component peer. That has to be one, first of all, of equality. And it has to be based upon three things: respect, understanding, and trust between the two. Furthermore, it's not enough for the top people to have that. They must push that down through their chain of command. Every time I've seen this work, that's exactly what happened. Finally, because of the difference in cultures, it's harder for the military side to do this. In part, that's not because the military doesn't try. It tries very hard in a very structured way to figure out what's going on with the civilian component. It's that the civilian component, again, has a hard time explaining itself. Let me give you an example. The State Department you look at is actually two State Departments. You look at the wiring diagrams and the charts, both interagency and the State Department itself. Aside from being very confusing, it looks like a huge bureaucracy. And by any standard other than that of Department of Defense, it is a huge bureaucracy. With USAID, it's some 60,000 people, and it's about $50 billion. But that big organization does many things to support our diplomatic activities, but it cannot do policy itself. To quote Henry Kissinger, The spirit of policy and that of bureaucracy is diametrically opposed. So therefore, there is a second, almost invisible, informal operation around the State Department and the National Security Council. I call it policy cadre. Those are a group of people who have the trust of the President and the Secretary of State. Sometimes they're also senior leaders in the bureaucracy, assistant secretaries, undersecretaries, ambassadors. Other times they're not. They are special envoys. They're people pulled from lower in the bureaucracy and given special missions. But they report directly to the secretary and often to the president, and they own the issue. That happens on every important foreign policy matter that we deal with. Some, such as trade or climate, do not involve security, but essentially any major issue involving security, that will be the model, and that's the model that the military has to deal with. The person who is sitting across the table from a commander in a theater or a commander in a country is probably part of that policy cadre, and that person is going to be putting a whole lot of his or her effort into maintaining that relationship with the President and the Secretary of State and doing the major muscle movement policy things that they think are important. Let me give some examples of how, at the end, we carry out these policy missions. We'll start at the national level and work through host government, allies, partners, neighboring states, foes, and in the field. At the national level, presidents and sometimes secretaries of state, national security advisors make foreign policy. That's the rule in the United States and frankly in most other countries I've seen. But there are ways that Foreign Service and USAID offices over the past 80 years have made huge contributions. George Kennan in Moscow, writing a telegram he didn't think anybody would read that changed the whole second half of the 20th century with his containment theory. John Paul Vann, all but cashiered from the Army for telling the truth about Vietnam. He returns as a USAID civilian in MAC Cords, working in the field. He gets Tet right in essentially Saigon, and 4 years later, now he's commanding, the only time a civilian has ever done that, US military forces. He saves the Central Highlands from 3 North Vietnamese divisions and dies in the process. Richard Holbrooke, an assistant secretary, relatively junior position in the hierarchy of American foreign policy structures, seizes the Bosnia issue after heads of state and government for 3 years couldn't solve it in 1995. And within months, by weaving together military and diplomatic tradecraft and refusing to give up, he brings an end to that conflict. Finally, 2007, Brian Crocker, sitting next to Dave Petraeus in the US Congress for 10 hours. They defended the administration's policy that at the time was hanging by a thread in Iraq, and they turned that Congress around, they turned the American people around, saving, I think, both the Bush administration and certainly policy in Iraq. These people had 2 things in common. First of all, at an early point in their careers, they engaged themselves with foreign countries in the field, learning languages again and again. Secondly, they kept moving to the sound of the guns. They popped up all of the time in various complicated situations, and they learned from that. This is the model that we, more senior in the Foreign Service, try to use as examples for our more junior officers. Host governments, that's our day job in the Foreign Service, along with Washington and in the field. But the core mission of certainly an embassy, of an ambassador, and ultimately the Department of State is state-to-state relations. These have a formal aspect. We saw this at a very dramatic moment in 2008 when then General Lloyd Austin went down to Basra, where Prime Minister Maliki the Iraqi prime minister was holed up and basically besieged by Muqtada al-Sadr's militia. The message that Austin was bringing was the full support personally of President Bush for what Maliki was trying to do. But the person who actually delivered it, flying down next to General Austin, was an embassy officer, Ambassador Marcy Reese, because state-to-state relations, when they're really serious, have to be done, or almost always done, by the State Department, by the embassy. That's our role. Now, again, we're not a colonial service. We cannot transform our partner states, but we can do things that make a difference. You can call it co-option, although remember, other countries try to co-opt us. That's what the embassies all around here in Washington do. In Iraq, in 2004, we couldn't end corruption. We couldn't infuse the population with love of democracy. But what we could do is get the government to accept the UN running a very intrusive and very successful election campaign that led to the purple finger election, and frankly led to the Iraqi people slowly warming to the idea of a democratic system. We couldn't end the extraordinarily ineffective Iraqi economic situation in 2004, but we could work with technical experts from US banks and from the US Treasury to ensure that the Iraqi central bank had a hard currency as solid as the dollar that has in various ways helped Iraq move forward. We couldn't wean the Iraqis from their dependency on oil. What we could do is, by working with their oil ministry, by working with the international oil companies, get that oil production up by almost 2.5%. Right now, it's the second largest producer of oil in OPEC. On a good day, almost half as much as Saudi Arabia. That has a huge impact on the country's viability and resilience. Finally, we couldn't eliminate the deep splits between Iraqi Kurds and Iraqi Arabs. But what we could do is find ways to moderate the competition, to put it in the right channels, to ensure that both sides were able to deal with each other. Eventually, this was helped by the US military, which set up what were called joint platoons along the fault lines between Kurdish and Arab Iraq. These things don't make huge differences in a day, but on the margins, they're the kind of thing that embassies are able to do, working with the US military, working with Washington, working with our partners and allies to make the situation enough better to stay in the game. And in the world of irregular warfare, particularly under the pressures of strategic competition, that has to be good enough. Finally, a couple of other things we do. We put together the Defeat ISIS Coalition. Now, most of the work, frankly, was done in the field in Baghdad by CJTF OIR and by CENTCOM in Tampa, which set up a huge international coalition operation. They did most of the work. But getting countries to sign up to the coalition was a job for the State Department. Envoy Brett McGurk did it. I did it. Our successors have done it because countries want to know, what is the overall policy? What do I get from the United States? What do I get from the other coalition countries if I contribute this, if I contribute that? These are profoundly political issues. When the coalition almost came apart in October 2019, after the Turks went into northern Syria, the French in particular, but other countries were furious, demanded a foreign ministers meeting of all of the key coalition countries, basically to read the Turks out. And we realized that we would have to, some formal way, fix this problem. Everybody came to Washington in late October. The foreign ministers were all there, and the way these things work, the foreign ministers don't do the work. That's done by one level below, deputy foreign ministers, political directors, and they all came along with their foreign ministers. The foreign ministers went off for a day of useless speeches and a 3-hour lunch with Mike Pompeo, our Secretary of State, hosting. And as Pompeo's man for the coalition, I had to stay with him. So therefore, we needed someone to run the entire debate among all of these 30 countries about how the coalition should move forward, how to deal with Turkey, Turkey's complaints about the SDF's relations with the PKK, and so forth. I used my chief of staff, who a month before had been, in military terms, a field grade officer just before she'd been promoted. She was able to work all of these elements by shuttle diplomacy. She knew the terrain, she knew Turkey, she knew Iraq, she knew Afghanistan, she knew the whole irregular warfare environment, and she brought home a document that everybody in the end, including the Turks and the French, could sign. That officer today, a professor here at NTU, Denise Marsh. Another example, working with neighboring states, again and again in irregular warfare, be it Pakistan, on Afghanistan, be it Syria and Iran, when we were in Iraq in the first decade of this century, and Turkey and Iran again, when we were running our defeat ISIS operation in Iraq and Syria, interfere in what we're doing. They do this for their own reasons. We're operating in their near vicinity, and they create major problems for us. This was, I think, decisive with Afghanistan, with the Pakistani involvement, and it was a major problem in Iraq and Syria. The State Department's job is to somehow deal with this problem, but it cannot deal with it without the cooperation of the US military. When the Turks really got serious with President Trump in December of 2019, and General Robinson will remember much of this, we had to find a way to, first of all, keep the Turks at bay. Secondly, to get the president to reverse his position that we should just all pull out. There, it was the military guys on the ground who came up with a buffer zone concept, working with our partners, the SDF, that we were able to use, deploy with the Turks. We solved the problem for almost a year. The problem came up again, working with our military in the field. We were able to find a way to continue doing what we were doing with our partners on the ground without having to deal with Turkey coming in and scrambling the whole thing. Now, is it precarious? Of course, but it's been holding now with one interruption for over 3 years. That again is what victory looks like. Another thing we do is with foes and enemies. Negotiating with the other side is really important. It establishes clarity. It establishes a sense of trust. That's not enough to resolve disputes. Disputes, be they political or be they military, usually have deep underlying causes, inconsistencies between our view of how the world should work or how some country should develop and the views of the other side. Sometimes these inconsistencies, these contradictions have to be fought out literally by military force. Sometimes they can be negotiated away. But nonetheless, the first step is talking to the other side. There are two rules here. First of all, you have to realize that talking alone, diplomatic contact with the other side, is not going to solve anything. It just opens the door and smooths the way to solutions. The solutions still require pressure or compromise, carrots or sticks. You have to have the right cards and you have to know how to play them. You can't just smile and meet with the other side. The second thing is, and we've seen this repeatedly, you have to have everybody on board. In negotiating in the Iraq context, in the Syria context, you had to make sure that the host country knew that we were negotiating with essentially their enemies, that Washington knew what was going on. If the State Department was doing it, but the US military did it. And you had to know where our partners and allies were in this as well. They may have different views of how we should deal with the other side. So it was a constant coordination effort. I was involved in this at one point in 2005 with the religious leader of the Sunni resistance in Iraq, Harith al-Dari. And we decided that we would go out and try to persuade him to shift sides. We didn't succeed, but we took our local military commander. It was a guy named Milley when he was a brigade commander, And the way we did it was I played the good cop and tried to make a persuasive case for a diplomatic solution to our problems with his Sunni community. Miley surrounded the mother of all battles mosque where Harith al-Dari was holed up with Abrams tanks, and every time Dari would say something stupid, Miley would gaze towards his pistol. So he was the very, very bad cop. I was a good cop. Finally, our work in the field. That's where most of the U.S. military and our coalition partners see us. And that's a tough environment for us. The people we put out there in the civilian component, be they state, USAID, or from other agencies, these are all volunteers. Foreign service officers, by their contract, can be audited, but we never use that authority in Iraq or Afghanistan. Other agencies, they have to be volunteers. They're not trained or experienced in combat the way people in the military are, but they do very, very well under those conditions. There are some things that, frankly, civil affairs units in the U.S. military can do as well or better than we do in the field. There are some things we do well. I would single out, for example, USAID's Office of Transition Initiatives. They're excellent in early recovery and other things. Another thing that we do is we are plugged into the international world of reconstruction, humanitarian assistance. That is huge. 99% of all development assistance, of all humanitarian assistance in the world is not done by the US military or even by the US. It's done by international consortiums of NGOs, of international organizations, and other countries, equivalents to USAID, that we were able to deploy very effectively, for example, in the Defeat ISIS campaign with UNDP in Iraq, and with various jury-rigged support from Saudi Arabia, the Emiratis, and other countries in northeast Syria. But finally, the thing that we really emphasize in the field is getting out officers who know what is going on, who can report back to us, just like the military does, intelligence on what is happening, where local people are in terms of their loyalties to their government, their views of us, what's happening in the field. This is a critical foreign service skill. Beirut, 1983. There have been few worse moments in US diplomatic history. Our embassy was down, Marine barracks blown up, the French paratrooper barracks blown up with some 60 French soldiers killed. A six-way civil war was going on. For all of this, we had a political officer at the embassy in Beirut. This officer spoke excellent Arabic. He had been there for years. He knew everybody on all sides. He was an Air Force brat. He knew and respected the military. Night after night, he would slip between the lines, picking up information, doing everything he could in a very, very dire situation to make it as good as possible, to keep it from turning out even worse. That officer was Ryan Crocker. 25 years later, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. I'll stop now. I'm happy in a moment to take your questions, but once again, it was a delight to be here with you today. Thank you.
Ambassador Jeffrey, I wish you could see the number of heads in this room nodding vigorously over your comments. I know it's hard when you can't see your audience so well, but thank you. The span of what you have just covered in these comments is just remarkable. We're so grateful. I should introduce myself very quickly before you are confused about who this strange voice adding to the conversation is. I'm Professor Caroline Davidson. I'm one of the faculty members that teach down here at the CHSOMA program on Fort Bragg. And I have the extremely special privilege today to be able to bridge between the two campuses, and particularly to introduce to you all Major General Patrick Roberson, who is the Commanding General of the JFK Special Warfare Center and School. And the real reason that this relationship has developed, that we're allowed to do this discussion this way today, is the last time I believe that Ambassador Jeffrey and General Roberson met, they were downrange in Syria when the ambassador was the special envoy to the coalition to defeat ISIS, and General Roberson was, of course, commanding the suggestive Operation Inherent Resolve. So we really have a really special opportunity here today to hear comments from both sides. General Roberson is going to offer us some initial commentary on the ambassador's remarks. Again, a huge span of remarks, so I'm going to be very interested to hear what he has picked out as having real value to the student bodies on both campuses. As we listen to those comments, the chat will open up for our audience members to submit their questions as well, and we will be able to relay them to the ambassador. Thank you all for your patience with all the tech, and I'm looking forward to opening up a really great conversation into Q&A. But first of all, General Roberson, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Caroline. Ambassador Jeffrey, thank you for the comments. I'm going to keep mine short and we'll get on to Q&A really quick, but I did want to highlight a couple things and just open up a few other things. Ambassador Jeffrey, I could not agree more with your comments. I'm going to highlight the fact that when we work together, you're the special, envoy, special representative for Syria. I was the commander. I think you mentioned very clearly about the idea of the diplomatic side and the military side working closely together. I'd like to think that was a model for how we did that. I appreciated everything that you did over there, your close cooperation, how you ran the diplomatic side, how you incorporated the military side. So not only did you talked a good game there, but you actually lived that. So I appreciate that. And from others that I've talked to when you're in the ambassador in Iraq, it was the same program. So thank you for that. Straight shooting and very much brought in the military side. I'll just kind of start from the top on the military piece on irregular warfare, and I'll lay it out in some of the terms that Ambassador Jeffrey discussed. Right now, the military's gone to basically great power competition was the first way they laid it out. They've evolved a few other thoughts in that. Integrated deterrence is, I think, what we're calling it right now. That's kind of the grand strategy that we're using in our doctrine to talk about these things. As far as the Army goes and some of the other militaries, the first thing that they have to think about in this is deterrence. They have to deter our competitors out there, or what we'd see is peer competitors, China and Russia, mainly China. The way that the Army looks at that is it basically puts all of its effort towards focusing on how do you deter and fight a large scale the Army ground combat operation. Okay, that's a lot of bandwidth for the military. They're trying to basically rebuild themselves, right now to be able to do that. That leaves us in the SOF community with one of our core missions being irregular warfare. So not only have we got to be we have to focus on this large-scale ground combat piece, but we also have to be experts at irregular warfare, which I think that we are. So it's kind of given us more work as opposed to less work. How do we see ourselves in a potential large-scale ground combat operation? How do we see ourselves conducting, irregular warfare? And I will also say I completely agree with Ambassador Jeffrey's comments to the sense of it is far more likely that this great power competition that we're in right now will play itself out in the field of irregular warfare as opposed to some type of large-scale ground combat operation. So I don't think the logic has changed much from the 1947 on with the advent of nuclear weapons and everything else. Most things will be kept at the irregular warfare level. A large-scale ground combat piece could happen, but more likely irregular warfare. For us in the SOF world, that means do we have to change a bit of our doctrine, some of our focus? Do we change the way that we're focused? Do we continue? We have a very regional focused force right now that's, Southcom, CENTCOM, PACOM, etc. Do we keep that? We're talking about these things right now. Or do we change to more of hey, I focus on, the Indo-PACOM region, or I focus on UCOM, that's where I put all my business. I think, we should be regionally focused with the ability to be much more versatile and react to anything, whether it's an irregular warfare fight or a large-scale ground combat fight. And I think that's where we're at. Generally focused forces, SOF forces that can do irregular warfare anywhere. That's where we're at. And I'm gonna come down a little bit and talk a little more about what we've learned over the last years. And you talked about Syria at the end. I would just say for me and for I think others that are in our formations right now, we learned a lot about Syria because it was really an irregular warfare campaign of the highest order, because we were partnered with an irregular force, fighting an irregular force in a state that had an actual government that it was not in the area that we were in, but also several different other powers fighting in that place also, including, Lebanese, Hezbollah, Iran, Russia. So it was really something that I think brought most of our irregular warfare expertise to the forefront. Very, very fast changing, versatile area where we're working closely with diplomats. We are, balancing a lot of different, like really large scale ground combat with a partner against an ISIS, a ground army fighting a counterinsurgency at the same time, holding other powers at bay while trying to move policy forward. So I think we've learned a lot from that. One of the things that we did incorporate after this is a change in civil affairs. You mentioned civil affairs and how civil affairs complements the State Department, USAID in a lot of ways. We looked at what we did there and we said, hey, transitional governance, the idea of, hey, how do we assist these governments that we're operating with, really in the idea, as you said, of co-option as opposed to deconstruction, because if you're transitioning a government, you can't afford to deconstruct something. You have to co-opt what's there. You can shape it around the margins, but you have to keep what you've got because that's what's working for you. You don't have the energy or the time or the effort to be able to do that. I really appreciated that part of your discussion. In the interest of time, I think I'm going to stop there, and we're going to move on to questions if that's all right.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Jeffrey.
Sir, we appreciate those insights very much as well.